Wagwan, everybody. Welcome to the Dis Afami History podcast, where we'll be speaking about history and as well family history and how history relates in terms of Caribbean people for the present as well as in the past, and how in the past what that does and brings forth for what we are going through at present and what we can learn from our history, from our family, and take that moving forward. So I do hope you enjoy the podcast. And if you like it, please ensure to subscribe, like, and review. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Valens, for coming on to the podcast and to talk about your the exhibit, Provisions, and how that relates to Caribbean history from a food perspective. So before we start, I'll get you just to introduce yourself. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. I am a professor in the English department at Salem State University, and I research in Caribbean literatures and particularly in food studies and food writing. So I teach all sorts of classes on Caribbean studies and literary studies, and then I write on Caribbean food.
Oh, perfect. Thank you. And, we'll start now. And then just to say, what was the motivation that brought this exhibit to life?
Yeah, with pleasure. So I've been researching Caribbean cookbooks for a book project that I was working on. And I was talking about it with my students, and they all got very excited about talking about food and using food as a way to think about history and culture. So I taught a course, and this exhibit is the product of a course, and the course was on provisions. And it also was thinking about, making sure that we're making things that are actually accessible to people outside of the academy. And so that's why we made this exhibit.
Oh, perfect. That's wonderful. And again, food carries, cultural and historical significance. And how does this exhibit explore this cultural importance?
So I think it's important to say I teach at a college and university in New England. And so one of the things is most of the students in this class don't have personal backgrounds in the Caribbean, but they have personal backgrounds in New England. And so one of the things about food is that there's a lot of foodways that connect us. And so in New England, we think of pumpkins and sweet potatoes and yams as being part of our foodways. And so part of this is an opportunity to understand whatever your background is, the foods that you eat, once you start understanding the histories of those foods, you realize you're participating in that food tradition in some way. But I think for the other part for cultural significance is, food writing comes up in more technical spaces. It comes up in histories and in botanies, but it also comes up all over works of literature and all over cookbooks. And the students read a lot of cookbooks. I work in cookbooks, and I really think that cookbooks are a place where generally women are writing down their food traditions, but they're also writing down their cultural histories, right? And they're naming and formulating their cultural histories.
No, definitely. I know with researching my family tree, I've found a couple of, recipes on the back of an envelope from, my grandmother, of what she's written in it, just to see that handwriting, to see what they formulated for the recipe to make this particular item, which is kind of interesting. So, there is definitely power in the word.
Yeah, and which words people use, right? You start to understand some of the histories that they're connected to, right? So, if you use the word provisions versus if you use the word hard food, right? That's going to help you understand, does your family history come from from Trinidad or from Jamaica, right? So thinking about those words are really geographically and culturally located also.
So just as you mentioned, what is provisions, first of all? And go ahead.
So provisions is it's a set of foods. Sometimes people say that they're root vegetables, but they're not all root vegetables. So it's a set of starchy foods that includes yam, cassava, pumpkin, all of the root vegetables that go along with that, and plantain. And the reason that they're called provisions comes from the history of slavery in the Caribbean. So slaves were not fed enough food, and then there started to be regulations about giving slaves enough food. And one of the ways that plantation owners got around actually giving their slaves enough food was that they would give them grounds, a space to plant some of their own food. And those were called provision grounds.
Yes.
And they were generally located relatively far from the plantations, off of the good soil. And so you had to grow foods there that didn't need a lot of tending, and that didn't need to be harvested the second they got ripe. And so what are those foods? Pumpkins, cassava, yams, sweet potatoes, right? All of those root vegetables. Slaves were often only allowed to go and tend them about once a week. And at the same time, because it isn't only a story of deficit, folks knew what were the very nutritious foods. Cassava and yams and pumpkins are very nutritious foods. Plantain is a very nutritious food. And so they were also planting foods that had high nutritional value for the time and energy that they took. So from provision grounds, you get ground provisions, and then that gets shortened to provisions. But it is also called hard food in some places. It's just called food in some places. In the Hispanophone Caribbean, it's called viandas or víveres with a V. In Haiti, it's called vivre. So and those relate to life and living, right? And viandas relates to meat, but it's like as a staple food. But generally, the word provisions is in the English-speaking Caribbean and diaspora kind of the shorthand.
Yeah, it's very interesting. The words that are used, as you just said, especially in Haiti, vivre, meaning life. But wow, it's just amazing. So, and then of course, I guess with provisions, why did you use it in the exhibit title?
So there's partly, I'm just going to say, I was really inspired by this cookbook, right? So I think I had been reading this cookbook, Michelle and Suzanne Rousseau's Provisions, The Roots of Caribbean Cooking. And it's a really compelling cookbook that starts to trace some of those histories. And I wanted more of the histories. But also, I think the word provisions, it points to, even though it comes from provision grounds, which is the history of slavery, it points to folks who turned that around and said, we're providing, right? It's the idea of providing, giving sustenance. And it's a really welcoming and powerful word.
Definitely it is. And so with the Provisions exhibit, it's online. So are there any, interactive elements or activities that the audience can engage with to understand the concept of provisions and the history of these food types?
So it's a series of exhibits, each focused around either a particular provision or a particular aspect of a provision. And then as you go into them, there are timelines, there are story maps. So it is mostly, it's reading, but there's a bunch and viewing, but there are all these different ways to go through the timelines and the story maps and the images and the texts and kind of pick one and dig into it, or go through all of them together and see the kind of circle that they create.
Perfect. And would you be able to just kind of show that to us, just so people can get an idea, and they can just kind of go through it afterwards?
Pleasure.
Because I can always put that in the show notes as well. So this is what they're going to see. Perfect.
This is the front page. And then if you go down, I'm going to show you the first one, the Botanical History of Yams in the Caribbean, which has some text, right? Some explanation of what is yams. And then, right, this sort of looking at, right, so these images with explanation of the images. And then I'm going to go back and show you another exhibit that has more of um, some other versions. So this one is a story map. So this is a map, and you can either click through it to look at the different pieces, or you can click on a part of the image and move through. So all of these have some combination of maps and historical images, and then some explanatory text.
Yeah, which is great because then you get to see what's happening for the Caribbean, not and of course how the different islands kind of connect. I'm sure that they have different names for the same item as well, because I think that mentions that as well, which is fantastic to see that all in one place. So because as well, talking about language, so the exhibit does explore the relationship between language and foods and its connection to the continent of Africa. Would you be able to speak to some of the examples of this?
Yeah, so one of the ways really comes in with looking at the histories of these foods. So yam is a really good example. The word yam comes from West African languages. Nyame is probably closer to West African pronunciations. And I'm saying West African in general, in part because of the way that the slave trade mixed people up, but also because West African languages, while they are distinct, are part of the same language group. And so those root words, as they translate into words in the Caribbean, they're the same root words in most West African languages. So yam is a really good one. Fufu is another really good one, right? So the word fufu means pounding. It's a word for a particular technique. So if you pound something and then make it into a mash by pounding it and then reform it, that's the verb. Fufu is the pounding to a mash so that you can reform it. And the word cuckoo, which is in Barbados, also comes from that same. It's just a shift from fufu. And again, that some of the times you can hear in West African languages, fufu, the accent is on the U part. So there's in a lot of West African languages, there's an accent. If there's a multi-syllable word, the accent is on the end of the word. So if you hear a word that has the accent there, you can start to think, oh, that probably has a West African origin. Like okra doesn't have a West African origin, but kimbombo, which is what it's called in the Dominican Republics, in Cuba, mostly in Cuba, that's just a West African word, kimbombo. So as you know, if you sort of trace the words around different parts of the Caribbean, sometimes you find like, oh, that's the West African root for that word. And all of the plantain-based foods. Plantain is not a West African word, but once you start getting into the foods themselves, a lot of those foods have West African roots. And in Dominican Republic, one of the main central dishes is called mangu, and that comes from a West African word, mangusi, which is again a plantain preparation.
Yeah, it just, as I said, I just find all of this very fascinating. And I mean, growing up, it's just hearing the conversations of my mother's friends and them saying, oh, we call this in this island, and we call it this in this island. And they're describing the exact same food type. So it just having that connection, right? So for that particular period. Now, again, continuing on the food types mentioned and featured in the exhibit, most are staples and favorites and provide a history with a connection of slavery and native populations. Would you be able to speak to some examples such as like pumpkin and squash?
Yeah, so this is a really rich one because pumpkin is indigenous to the Americas. And so but other squashes are indigenous to Africa. And so this is one of the things that happened. One of the ways that you get what some people call Afro-Indigenous foods comes from that combination where you have Indigenous folks in the Caribbean who are making these preparations. Folks are forced from Africa to the Caribbean, and they find recognition in the foods that they already are making and in the preparations that they already are using. And so I think pumpkin and pumpkin soup in particular becomes such an important staple across the Caribbean because it is something where folks with either directly from or descendants from Africa understand that food. And then it's also an indigenous food in the Caribbean. But that word, the words for pumpkin are really rich, right? So it's called pumpkin in English, and that's from the Arab word for melon. And that's because when colonists brought, very early on, they brought pumpkins back to Europe, and they didn't have a word for that because it didn't exist. But it looks kind of like a melon. And so they called it words for melon. And so that's why pumpkin is described as melon. But in some of the early colonial cookbooks, there are some recipes for pumpkin soup that say you can use melon instead, which you can't, right? Like that would be a terrible idea, but it's because these are written by people who they were written by colonists. They didn't actually know the foods they were writing about. And so they make this language, confusion. But in Haiti, the word for pumpkin is jumu or jurumous, and that comes from a Tupi word, which is an indigenous language in what's now Brazil. So you see that connection. In the Dominican Republic, it's called auyama, which is an Arawakan word that's also still used in Colombia. So you see the indigeneity of that food through these words, and then you just see the technique, right? So the technique of mashing and boiling, right, is a technique that, first of all, is a technique that was widely used by indigenous people in the Caribbean, right, and there's beautiful ceramic pots and a tradition of ceramic pots that are still used, and then of course, as folks are coming from Africa, they come with the tradition of iron pots, and so they bring the iron pot and the knowledge of how to make iron pots with them, and so then you get this soup that is made again through these Afro-Indigenous traditions, and then you get the add-ins, right? Then sometimes people put salt pork or salt beef into their pumpkin soup, again, sort of through the legacy of slavery and the ways in which salt pork and salt beef were part of slave food traditions.
It's a very rich history, and to know how it all kind of connects. And so why was it important in the exhibit to show the archaeological and origins of these provisions?
Yeah, so I think part of it is that the trajectories of these foods are in many ways the trajectories of creolization in the Caribbean, right? And so on the one hand, the food histories allow us to trace back to some of those further ancestries and histories. And at the same time, the foods that are made with them in the Caribbean, those are Creole foods. And those are the result of all of those different histories coming together in the Caribbean. And there's lots of European ancestry in that food too, right? This isn't only indigenous and African ancestries in the food. It's the ways in which in the Caribbean, the Creole brings all of those together, and it brings Asian food traditions together also, right? Both Indo-Caribbean and Sino-Caribbean. And there's the use of all the onion, pepper, right? Those traditions, those probably come from Sephardic Jewish traditions that were part of that diaspora into the Caribbean. And so I think when we look at the individual histories and they're coming together, we really get a deep understanding of how Caribbean culture comes about through creolization. It is Creole culture.
Definitely, yeah. All of those mixing together. And so, when most people think about food, it usually invokes, warm and fond memories and a connection to a period of time that was nice to have, and this was revealed in the exhibit. And was this the intent behind to have this portrayed in the exhibit? Would you?
Yeah, it really was, and the the students who created the exhibit and I, we talked a lot about how we're investigating some pretty painful histories. And we are looking at the ways in which individual people and communities and cultures have survived and sustained and created beautiful and delicious things in spite of the painfulness of those histories. And so to focus on these foods are delicious, they're nutritious, they are incredible ways, and the process of making them and eating them brings people together, right? And it's really important for me, and I think it was really important for the students to not just think about, oh, if we're thinking about Caribbean history and the history of foods, then we're stuck in the pain. The pain is really there; it can't be denied, but it's leads to and has now been taken into spaces of celebration and beauty.
Definitely. And so with cuisine, it's an integral part of the culture. How does Caribbean cuisine, with its diverse flavors and ingredients, how does this influence the exhibit and the message being presented?
Yeah, so I think, as you follow those histories, I think part of it is you may start out thinking, whether you're a student or whether you're looking into your own history and thinking, in my past, I'm going to uncover my, West African roots, or I'm going to uncover my indigenous roots. And part of what I think most people end up uncovering is the multiplicity of those roots, right? And so as you follow, if you follow the cookbooks that were on your mother's shelf, even if she didn't use them for some reason, she might have had some cookbooks, right? If you follow the notes that your grandmother might have written down, or that your auntie might have written down when she was listening to your grandmother, right? If you look at those, what you end up finding is these personal histories, these cultural histories, right? So you talk to other people and you're like, wait, you make that too. And you make it a little differently, right? So it's this space where you can really trace out a lot, like Edouard Glissant is a famous Caribbean theorist, and he talks about how the Caribbean is both a unified place and everything comes from someplace else. And in the food, you see that, right? There are distinct family cultures, there are distinct national cultures, there are distinct pan-Caribbean cultures, and each one has its own set of histories and combinations.
Definitely. It's as you said, it's the different but yet the same, and that is the connection. Food seems to be the connection to bring all of that together as well. So as we come to a close, what would you say is something that we didn't discuss that you would like to share to the audience about the exhibit?
So I really want to shout out to the students who created this exhibit. So it was a group of students, and their names are on the exhibit by each of their exhibits. But they did an incredible work of gathering and presenting this. And I also want to say I have a book on this topic. It's called Culinary Colonialism: Caribbean Cookbooks and Recipes for National Culture, and it will be on shelves in February, so coming soon.
Perfect, and I'll make sure to include that in the show notes so people can be able to see that. But again, I wanted to thank you, Professor Valens, for coming on to the podcast and to speak about the Provisions exhibit. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Hoped you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please make sure to like, follow, subscribe, and write a review for the episode wherever you listen to your podcast. Thank you.